Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised, and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of It's Murder Up North. First of all, this two-parter has evolved into a three-parter, which personally I think isn't a bad thing, as now this episode will focus on Lesley Whittle. And episode 22 will be about Donald Neilson, which will allow me to give you more insight into who Lesley Whittle was as a person, but we'll also be able to explore who Donald Neilson was and what drove him to commit the crimes he did. I would, however, recommend that if you haven't listened to episode 20, please check it out before listening to this episode. I've received some fantastic reviews and feedback, which is always appreciated. Word of mouth helps the show to grow, so if you love It's Murder Up North, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. You can connect with me and fellow listeners on Facebook at www.facebook.com/groups/MUP North or on Twitter at Murder Up North. And you can access exclusive content such as videos and early episode releases for just $1 at www.patreon.com/It's Murder Up North. In previous episodes, I've mentioned how wonderful the podcast community have been. The support I receive is unbelievable, and I know that some of you who are listening have found my show through them. Most of the podcasters I speak to are independent, who usually operate from home with fairly low-tech equipment. They do all their writing, researching and recording by themselves. So they deserve a huge shout-out. It wasn't until I started doing a podcast that I realised how much work goes into creating just one episode, which is why I do my podcast of the week. This week, I want to give a shout out to the Misery Machine podcast. I don't agree with them that true crime is boring, but I still love their show. So here's their trailer.
Is your true crime show getting a little too predictable?
Absolutely.
Are you sick and tired of all these Karens doing drink recipes and beer reviews?
I hate it.
We are the Misery Machine, and we're on an adventure to dismantle pop culture, current events, and uncover the mysteries of the universe.
Largely of the homicidal variety.
Listen to us every Monday on your favorite streaming platform.
True crime is boring. We're fixing that.
Now, let's head to the episode. Lesley Whittle was an attractive, dark-haired girl with hazel eyes who was only 5 foot tall and possessed a slender figure. Having spent several years at boarding school, she now lived at home with her mother Dorothy and was attending Wolfram College in Wolverhampton, studying mathematics, geography and geology, with the ambition to go into teaching. As she ventured into adulthood, she had started learning to drive, purchasing a second-hand car and planning her future. Her love life was also blossoming, as she had started a relationship with Richard Forder, a rugby player and first-year student at Sheffield University. Despite being 125 miles apart, the couple spent any free time possible together. Those who knew her described her as a down-to-earth girl, who when not spending time with her friends or boyfriend could be seen listening to the jukebox while her mum played bingo. She loved spending a quiet night at home with her mum. The two were very close, especially since her father had passed away when she was just 12 years old. Her life was one of relative comfort. Her father, along with his brothers, had been owners of a successful bus company, and prior to his death in 1970, her father had ensured that his family were well cared for. He had made preparations that Lesley, her brother Ronald, and their mother Dorothy would have financial security in the event of his death. Lesley's fate, however, had been decided 3 years before she was kidnapped in Reader's Digest in 1972, which covered the kidnapping of 20-year-old Barbara Makel in December 1968. Barbara, who was a student at Emory University in Atlanta, had been planning to return home to Florida for the festive season. Unfortunately, she had fallen ill with the Hong Kong flu, a global flu pandemic which claimed the lives of over 1 million people worldwide. Unable to travel home, her mother Jane travelled to be with her daughter. The pair checked into the Roadway Inn Motel, which was situated on Claremont Road in Decatur on the 17th of December 1968. The mother and daughter were awoken by 2 police officers, bearing news that Barbara's boyfriend had been involved in a car accident. Alarmed by the news, Jane Makel let the officers in, at which point they grabbed hold of Jane, rendered her unconscious with a chloroform-soaked cloth. Then they proceeded to tie her up, before turning their attention to her 20-year-old daughter Barbara. At gunpoint, they took Barbara from the home and drove her into a forest just off South Berkeley Lake Road, where they had dug a grave, inside which they had placed a purpose-built coffin. The kidnappers forced Barbara into the box and told her to hold a sign that stated she had been kidnapped and featured the kidnappers' demands. The kidnappers then took photographs of her. The perpetrators closed the lid of the coffin, filled in the hole, burying Barbara alive. However, they did not plan to kill her. The box contained food and drink, which they had drugged to keep their captive sedated. They had also ensured that despite being buried underground, the box had a supply of air from 2 pipes. And Barbara had been given a battery-operated torch. Her kidnappers demanded a ransom of $500,000 for her safe return. As the daughter of a wealthy property developer, the ransom was paid, and the police were advised of her location. After 3 days in her underground tomb, Barbara was rescued, suffering from dehydration but otherwise unharmed. This case was the spark that inspired Donald Neilson to plan his own kidnapping for ransom. He had not decided who to target until a story in the Daily Express caught his attention. The article covered the story of a successful businessman, George Whittle, Lesley's father, who had built up a substantial fortune from the family coach business. Upon his death, he had left his estate to his 2 children, Ronald, who was to receive £107,000, Lesley, who was gifted £82,000, and their mother, Dorothy, who was left 3 houses and £70,000. It was not just this inheritance that piqued Neilson's interest, but the ongoing dispute that had led to the article being written. Despite having 2 children with George Whittle and bearing his surname, Dorothy was not actually George's wife. He was married to another woman called Selina. They had separated 30 years earlier, however, they never divorced. Selina had been living in poverty for the last 3 decades, only learning of her husband's wealth and second family upon his death. In May 1972, Selina Whittle started legal proceedings to obtain reasonable provisions from her husband's estate, and this court battle was the subject of the newspaper article. Donald Neilson claimed he was angered by the manner in which 75-year-old Selina Whittle had been treated, and believed that her unfair treatment was a justifiable reason to target the Whittles. The Whittle family lived in a post-war Art Deco 4-bedroom detached property called Beechcroft that sat on Bridgenorth Road on the outskirts of the village of Highley. The Shropshire village sits close to the River Severn, surrounded by farmland, and was once populated by coal miners and their families. The rows of red brick terraces standing as testament to its working class roots. January the 13th, 1975, been a crisp winter's day. A chill lingered in the air, and the frost shone like diamonds in the cool sunlight as it sank beneath the horizon, fading into a moonless night, and as the temperature dropped, the last few figures wrapped up in thick coats hurried to the warmth of their homes. As night closed in, the village fell quiet. Only the distant hoots of an owl broke the silence as lights in the houses began to be extinguished. In the dark streets, a shadow shifted in the stillness, their footsteps barely making a sound as they skulked, moving swiftly towards the Whittle's house. There were no lights on inside the home, and the curtains had been drawn. Dorothy and Lesley had retired to bed for the night. Lesley pulled the covers up tightly about her body, seeking warmth on that winter's night. Cosy in her bed, she drifted off to sleep, unaware of the cat-like figure that had entered the front door, proceeded up the stairs, and was silently skulking across the room. A black-gloved hand covered the girl's mouth. As she woke in terror, her eyes adjusted to the darkness. She saw the shadowy figure looming over her, with a gun pointed at her head. "Any tricks and you're dead," he warned. The frightened girl was forced from her bed, a gag placed over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Lesley tended to sleep in the nude, and she quickly grabbed the first article of clothing she could find, her long blue dressing gown. The masked figure forced the barefoot girl back down the stairs, passing through the lounge to leave a box of chocolates on the coffee table. Before they left, the gunman allowed Lesley to quickly put on a pair of slippers, and then proceeded to escort her from the house at gunpoint. Her kidnapper took her around the rear of the property and across a rugged field that lay beyond. They came to a dark green Morris 1100 in a secluded spot on a cul-de-sac. He opened the door and pushed Lesley Whittle inside. He then drove off with the terrified teenager lying on the back seat. At 7 a.m, Dorothy Whittle awoke. She trudged downstairs, still half asleep, frustrated that she couldn't find her slippers. The 40-year-old mother of two settled down at the kitchen table with her breakfast and a pot of coffee, expecting Lesley to appear ready for college, but she didn't. Nor was there the usual noises of her teenage daughter getting ready for the day. The shower hadn't been turned on, the floorboards hadn't even creaked. It was eerily silent upstairs. Presuming Lesley had overslept, she called up the staircase to her, but got no response. On the third attempt, and still with no answer, Dorothy paced up to her daughter's bedroom, feeling slightly annoyed. She pushed the door open, to find the bed unmade and unoccupied. Thinking perhaps Lesley had already woken up, Dorothy checked the bathroom and the other 3 bedrooms. She returned downstairs. She searched the living room and the kitchen, even considering that her daughter may have gone in the garden. But Lesley Whittle was nowhere to be found in the house. It was about this time that Ronald arrived home to find his mother in a panicked state. Telling her to take a seat in the lounge, Ronald decided to see if Lesley had maybe gone for an early morning walk. But before he could leave, he heard his mother cry out. She had found a note concealed inside a chocolate box, which had been placed on the coffee table. Written using a dynamo label printing machine, the long strip of tape lacked any punctuation and read, quote, "No police, £50,000 ransom to be ready to deliver. Wait for telephone call at Swan Shopping Centre telephone box. If no call, return following evening. When you answer, give name only, and listen. You must follow instructions without argument. From time you answer, you are on a time limit. If police or tricks, death. Swan Shopping Centre, Kidderminster. Deliver £50,000 in a white van. £50,000 in all old notes. £25,000 in £1 notes, and £25,000 in £5 notes. There will be no exchange only after £50,000 has been cleared, will victim be released? Dorothy sat on the edge of the sofa, stunned. Her eyes scanned the words over and over again as the reality sank in. She headed to the phone, only to find the line was dead. Against the kidnapper's demands, Dorothy and Ronald decided to contact the police and report the kidnapping. And as they awaited their arrival, Ronald began organising to get the ransom money in place. What followed was a catalogue of errors and miscommunication, which ultimately cost Lesley her life.
It wasn't just a matter of getting lost. I got slightly lost. That wasn't a long delay. What was a delay was, first of all, the delay in finding the message in the telephone box, which was over a quarter of an hour, and then the instructions at the end were not clear. The wall where I was supposed to stop, I didn't even see in my headlights. We shall never know for certain, but I feel, rightly or wrongly, that the way in which this was revealed in the press in the early days could quite easily have meant a quicker death than might have been for Lesley.
The police response was swift. However, the lead investigator, Bob Booth, was keeping an open mind regarding the kidnapping. Believing Lesley may have chosen to run away, he had two other options to consider. Had she been kidnapped by a group of her peers from college? Some of the evidence at the house suggested an inexperienced perpetrator. The theory that Lesley had left on her own accord was quickly dismissed. When they learned that the only items missing were Lesley's dressing gown, her mother's slippers, and a necklace given to her by her boyfriend, which she never took off. The absence of the dressing gown and slippers suggested she had left the house in haste. The temperature that night had dropped below freezing, and the 17-year-old was definitely not dressed for such conditions. The college theory was also quickly ruled out. Lesley was viewed by most of her fellow students as a frugal girl, who did not show any signs of possessing a great wealth. Bob Booth was a very experienced investigator. He had been responsible for solving over 70 murders, for which he had been awarded an MBE. One of the keys to his success was that he tended to approach investigations in the same manner as the FBI, and he planned to use all his knowledge and experience to ensure Lesley's safe return. Ronald Whittle was adamant that he would pay the ransom demand, and reluctantly DCI Booth agreed. He ordered that the notes were photocopied in the hope that they could be traced back to the kidnapper. That night, Lesley's brother headed to the phone box at the Swan Shopping Centre in Kidderminster. He was wired up with a radio so he could keep in communication with the police, who were then able to keep a safe distance away in order to prevent the kidnapper being spooked. Ronald stood inside the phone box, waiting desperately for it to ring. His extremities growing numb from the cold, he stamped his feet and rubbed his hands in an attempt to keep warm. The minutes ticked by, then the hours, and still no phone call. While Ronald waited in the cold night, a news report played on the TV.
News is coming in of a kidnapping in the Shropshire village of Highley. It's understood a young girl has been abducted and police have found a ransom demand. It's believed £50,000 is being asked for the safe return of Lesley Whittle, the daughter of a wealthy coach firm proprietor.
Despite the police's best efforts to keep the kidnapping out of the press in order to keep their involvement quiet, somehow the story had been leaked. It was a sensational news story of an attractive teenage heiress being kidnapped from her home in a quintessential English village and held to ransom. This meant the story quickly made national news. Meanwhile, at the Kidderminster phone exchange, the phone box's calls were being monitored. All that was needed was the phone to ring, Ronald Whittle to answer, and the call would be recorded. However, when the phone did ring at midnight, it continued to ring. It rang persistently without anyone answering it. Unbeknownst to Bob Booth and those at the phone exchange, the officer in charge of monitoring the ransom drop decided that due to the press release, they had been compromised, and as such, he stopped the operation and told Ronald to withdraw at 9:30 p.m. The press release was a devastating blow to the police and the family. All hopes of keeping Lesley's kidnapping secret had been dashed. This led to major criticism not only of the press, but of DSI Bob Booth, who had failed to request a media blackout, which would have prevented the story going public. By the following morning, the press had descended on the small village of Highley, eager to speak to the family. The curtains of the family home were kept closed to protect the Whittles from prying glances. Once again, Ronald Whittle returned to the phone booth at the shopping centre in Kidderminster and waited for the call. But this time, it was not just the police who were there watching him. A throng of press reporters and photographers hounded Lesley's brother whilst he waited for the phone to ring. With the baying pack trying to get their news story, Ronald waited. He paced, he sat down, jumped on the spot to keep warm. Hours passed, and the hordes outside the phone box began to dwindle. Yet still Ronald stayed, willing the phone to ring. But by 1 a.m, the cut-off time the kidnapper had stated, the police told the distraught brother to head home. They continued to monitor any incoming calls at the phone exchange, but none arrived at the designated telephone box. On the same night that Ronald lingered in the phone box, 15 miles away at a freight yard in Dudley, security guard Gerald Smith was on patrol when he caught a hooded figure trespassing. As he chased after the intruder, the shadowy figure disappeared, before approaching Smith from behind and shooting him 6 times. Donald Neilson fled the scene, leaving behind vital clues. This incident meant that Neilson was not able to call Ronald at the phone box in Kidderminster. Gerald Smith was found early the following morning, as workers began to arrive for the day. He was taken to hospital, and despite the 6 bullet wounds that punctured his back, he survived. However, just over a year later, he died due to complications caused by the attack. Gerard Smith is not often quoted as one of Donald Neilson's victims, mainly because he survived the initial attack. And despite his death being directly because of Neilson's actions, an archaic law meant that if a victim died after 12 months and 1 day from injuries sustained in an assault, the perpetrator could not be charged. This law was changed in 1996, however Neilson was never formally tried for causing Gerald Smith's death. By the 17th of January, Lesley had been missing for 3 days. People began to come forward, stating that they had seen the teenager in places as far away as the south coast town of Bournemouth. However, it was believed by police that the girl was being held somewhere near her home. They had drawn this conclusion from the fact that Lesley had left the house in a dressing gown and slippers, and that no one had seen any vehicles near the home that night. A large search operation was undertaken. Search and rescue teams combed the surrounding farmland. Sniffer dogs hunted for Lesley's scent, and the police even requested the assistance of a Royal Air Force helicopter to assist in the search efforts. Every villager was questioned and every home searched, and during this massive operation, police got their first big lead. They began inquiries on a cul-de-sac which sat behind the Whittles' home, with a field in between. At the point on the street where the adjoining field opened out was a spot where some residents reported seeing a dark green Morris 1100 parked on the day of the kidnapping. They noted it was unusual, as it was not a spot that any resident would park, but because it was not near any houses. This derailed the theory that Lesley could be held close by, and as the search wound down for the day, the third night started with police no closer to finding the young heiress. At midnight, Leonard Rudd, who was the transport manager at the Whittle's coach firm, was working late in the office when the phone rang. He was elated to hear the sound of Lesley's voice, leaving instructions for another ransom drop.
Mom, you're going to go to Kids Grove Post Office telephone box. The instructions are inside. I'm okay, but there will be no police and no trips, okay?
The phone line in the office had been tapped, and the call was recorded. The call advised Ronald to drive to a phone box in Kidsgrove where he would locate the next clue. The family was so relieved to hear Lesley's voice. However, it would later emerge that this phone call had been pre-recorded. Lesley's brother set off on the 60-mile journey north to the town of Kidsgrove. After driving for an hour and a half, he arrived in the town that was unknown to him, with 5 police cars maintaining a safe distance. It was now dark as he drove around the unfamiliar roads of the town, losing his way twice before he located the phone box on the corner of Coronation Avenue. Inside the cast-iron phone box, the light flickered on and off. Ronald frantically searched for the kidnapper's clues, checking every nook and cranny he could think of. He had been in there nearly half an hour. Exasperated, he banged his fists against the notice board, and he heard something slide down behind it. Tugging at the panel, he managed to remove it, and there, on a long strip of dynamo tape, he found his next clue. But he had lost valuable time.
I had difficulty in finding the instructions in the phone box, and in consequence there was quite a considerable delay.
It instructed Ronald to head to a local beauty spot called Bathpool Park, and was advised to look for a torch flashing. It was 3:30 in the morning when he arrived, and despite waiting until dawn broke, there was no torch signal from the kidnapper. Despondent, Ronald Whittle was advised to withdraw. Neither the police nor Ronald could have known that just 200 metres from where he had parked his car, waiting for the torchlight, his sister was being held. It was decided that a covert search of the park would be conducted, in the hope that the kidnapper would not be aware of the police involvement. Over 2 days, officers from Scotland Yard conducted a discreet search of the area. Scotland Yard concluded the operation and reported that nothing of note had been found within the park, so the hunt for Lesley Whittle had once again hit a dead end. Desperate for leads, on the 4th day following Lesley's kidnapping, Dorothy and Ronald Whittle made a plea to the kidnapper to contact them. To emphasise their willingness to cooperate, Ronald even showed the suitcases and money ready to pay the ransom.
I am on the phone at home, I'm there day and night, I'm just hoping that they will get in touch with me. But I will make one other point. We have had a number of hoax calls, and these people, frankly, are wasting their time, because we shall not act, I shall not move from the house until I have definite proof that Lesley is alive and well.
If this silence of the kidnappers continues, will you start to fear the worst?
I suppose I must. I don't know. I never get round to thinking that way. If we could just know something, if somebody would just contact us anyhow, we don't care how.
The heartfelt pleas of the family failed to garner a response from the kidnapper. Bob Booth noted that Ronald was quite composed, and there was some suspicion this may have been part of an elaborate plot orchestrated by Ronald. It emerged that the relationship between the siblings could be strained at times, and sometimes they had some explosive arguments. Police also uncovered that Lesley's brother would benefit financially from his sister's death. It was 9 days since Lesley had been taken. West Midlands police were investigating the shooting of security guard Gerald Smith. A search of the freight yard had been performed. However, for some reason, a dark green Morris 1100 had been missed. It had been abandoned just a few hundred yards from where the security guard had been shot. When the vehicle was checked, they found that the tax disc and number plate did not match, and this led them to learn that the car had been stolen. Inside the car, they found torches, a gun with ammunition, a foam mattress, and a tape recorder, inside which was a cassette. The evidence was returned to the forensics laboratory, and the tape recovered from the car was played. The voice of a well-spoken young girl crackled through the speakers.
Now, go on to the M6 North to Junction 10, and then to the A454 towards Warsaw. Restrictions are taped under the shelf telephone box. No need to worry then, I'm okay. They're going to be wet because it's quite dry now. And this is very right. Okay?
By the beginning of February 1975, the police had drawn a terrifying link between Lesley Whittle's kidnapping and the post office murders perpetrated by the elusive Black Panther. The gun recovered from the stolen car, as well as the bullets recovered from Gerald Smith, were linked to those recovered from the post office crime scenes. Knowing what a vicious and callous killer they were dealing with, the need to find Lesley was more urgent than ever. Over 400 police officers were drafted in from all over the country to assist in the quest to track down Britain's most wanted man. But the Black Panther maintained his silence. Concerned he had gotten wind of the police involvement, Bob Booth decided to take an unprecedented step. During an interview, Ronald Whittle advised that he had been in contact with the kidnapper and had attempted to pay the ransom.
This is the first time I've mentioned this in actual fact, but I went out on the call. It was to Kidsgrove in actual fact.
Bob Booth then acted shocked when the interviewer asked if he was aware of Ronald's interactions with the kidnapper.
Are you going to have to go for this man if he contacts Ronnie Whittle again?
Pardon?
Are you
again?
going to... Yes.
What do you mean again?
Whittle says he's already made a contact. I would have thought you might have known about this.
But I don't know about it until you've just raised it now.
Well,
when did you get to know about it?
Well, we spoke to Whittle yesterday, and he mentioned it. He said it was the first time he'd mentioned it to the press, and I wasn't quite clear whether he'd mentioned it to you.
Are you telling me now that Ron Whittle has been out somewhere dealing with a man he believes to be the kidnapper?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not telling you. I'm simply saying that that's what Ronnie Whittle told me.
Well, then, I'm afraid this has got to terminate.
However, this failed to draw the culprit out of hiding. This, combined with the news that some school children had found a torch and some dynamo tape, which had the instructions "drop Kate's down shaft" in Bathpool Park, now gave the police the legitimate reason to do a more thorough search of the parkland, starting where the torch was found. The schoolboys reported finding it near a raised ventilation shaft, which had an iron gate for access, and the instructions had been taped to the torch. Standing at the entrance to the ventilation shaft, there was a clear view of the car park where Ronald Whittle had been advised to wait for the flash of a torch. Further inspection of the gate at the entrance of the shaft, investigators discovered that some of the bolts had been removed, and just in front of the gate was the screwdriver that had been used. Bob Booth was stunned by how easily these items were recovered, and he criticised the earlier search performed by Scotland Yard, which had concluded when nothing of significance had been found. This failure by the officers of Scotland Yard to find these pieces of evidence that were hidden in plain sight caused a rift between West Mercia Police and Scotland Yard. The decision was taken to enter the ventilation shaft, The gate was easily opened thanks to the bolts being removed, and one officer descended into the 4-foot-wide shaft, which plummeted 60 feet into the earth. Water trickled beneath his feet as he reached the bottom. With just a torch for light, it was a dank and unnerving environment. The floor beneath his feet was littered with items that had been thrown into the hole over the years, ranging from footballs to tin cans. From this shaft there seemed to be a series of tunnels that branched off in different directions. The officer felt compelled to explore these, but due to the risk of him getting lost or injured, he was ordered to return to the surface. It had now been 2 months since Lesley Whittle had been taken from her room in the middle of a cold January night. Her kidnapper had fallen silent, and the park was now the only lead the police had. After getting an idea of the intricate labyrinth of tunnels that ran under the park, ranging from a disused railway tunnel to drainage tunnels which had been installed 9 years earlier during the construction of a railway line, it was learned that these tunnels had several access points dotted around the park, which would have allowed the kidnapper to have numerous escape routes. One by one, the access points were searched, in the hope that they would yield more clues, but no one expected to find the body of Lesley Whittle. Bathpool Park was, and still is, a favourite spot for the residents of Kidsgrove. Children loved to play on the play park, dogs would run and bark on the many pathways, and as night time fell, courting couples would park up to enjoy the seclusion. While life thrived above ground, the subterranean world beneath the park was cold, dark and damp. Water dripped from the walls, and the scurrying, scratching and squeaking of rats echoed in the foreboding chambers. It was a dismal and hellish place. And as an officer was lowered into the shaft near to the railway line, he was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Roughly 55 feet down the shaft, he reached a platform. It was only narrow, probably about 2 feet wide, yet on it he found a piece of foam and a wire that had been tethered to the metal ladder. The officer followed the wire with his torch. It disappeared off the ledge and hung down into the darkness below. Struggling to maintain his balance on the ledge, the officer knelt down and peered into the gloom. He shone his torch, and its beam fell upon a sight the officer would never forget. There, hanging from a wire in the void, was the body of Lesley Whittle, and on the 7th of March at 4:15 p.m, the search for the 17-year-old heiress had come to a horrific end. She must have been so terrified, waiting in the darkness, hearing the rats scurrying around below her, the rumble of trains full of commuters passing by. I wonder if she could hear the sound of people in the park above. Lesley Whittle was abandoned on that narrow ledge in complete darkness. She was naked and had a wire noose round her neck. The teenager had been left there without food, water or light. Her last moments alive must have been truly horrendous.
How evil, how ruthless, how terribly wicked this man is that we've hunted for 7 weeks. God above, I never dreamt in my wildest dreams he'd do such a thing to a girl. It's terrible. Within 24 hours we'll have him if it means pulling every stop out in creation.
The girl's mummified remains were taken for a post-mortem to be performed. It had been speculated that Lesley starved to death, having been abandoned by her kidnapper. The post-mortem recorded that Lesley weighed 98 pounds. Her stomach and intestines were completely empty. It was determined she had lost a considerable amount of weight and her body appeared emaciated. The pathologist, however, concluded that the teenager did not starve to death, nor did she suffer a long, painful death by hanging. Dr. John Brown listed Lesley Whittle's cause of death as vagal inhibition. The pathologist stated that the shock of the fall from the platform had instantly caused her heart to stop beating. He explained, quote, "This would have been induced by high blood pressure in her carotid artery, caused by the wire tightening around her neck, triggering an alarm to her brain by the vagus nerve." End quote. The vagus nerve runs from the brain through the face, thorax, and to the abdomen. It is the longest and most complex of the cranial nerves. Dr. John Brown continued, "The brain's response to this urgent signal for a reduction in artery pressure would be to radically slow down the heart, and when that failed, her heart stopped altogether." Despite finding a wealth of evidence at Bathbull Park, including a fingerprint that matched to the Black Panther, the police were no closer to apprehending Donald Neilson. Lesley's kidnapping had now become a murder investigation, and DCI Bob Booth was removed from the case under a cloud of scrutiny regarding how the investigation had been handled. It would be a further 9 months before Donald Neilson would be apprehended in a chance encounter with PC White and PC Mackenzie. In next week's episode, I will explore who Donald Neilson was. I will also look further into his version of events. Many have speculated how Lesley Whittle died. Did she fall from the ledge or was she pushed? Please join me for episode 22 on Donald Neilson the Black Panther on Sunday.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.